Jot the White Feather's choice. The morning of February 17th, 1968, found Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock crouched in a spider hole barely 3 feet wide, his weathered Remington 700 cradled across his knees. The dense canopy of the Vietnamese jungle filtered the dawn light into shifting patterns of green and gold, and somewhere in the distance, the dull thump of artillery provided a constant rumbling heartbeat to the war. He'd been tracking a North Vietnamese sniper team for 6 days through terrain so thick that visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards. The white feather tucked into his bush hat, his trademark, his challenge to every enemy marksman in South Vietnam, caught a stray beam of sunlight as he adjusted his position. Back home in Arkansas, his mama had always said he was too stubborn for his own good. She'd packed his sea bag with homemade beef jerky and reminded him that pride went before a fall. Now 7,000 miles from Little Rock, with a bounty on his head worth more than most Vietnamese families saw in a lifetime, Hathcock wondered if she'd been right. The NVA sniper he'd been hunting had killed 3 Marines in the past week. Clean shots, professional work. Each kill had been precise, calculated, the kind that spoke of formal training and battlefield experience that matched Hathcock's own. He respected his adversary's skill even as he hunted him, recognizing in the enemy's tactics the same patience and precision that had kept him alive through 2 tours in this green hell. At 7:23 a.m., Hathcock spotted movement through a gap in the vegetation. Not the sniper he was hunting, but something that made him freeze with his eye pressed to his scope. 200 yards ahead, partially concealed by a fallen mahogany tree, sat a hastily constructed lean-to shelter. The jungle was littered with such abandoned positions from both sides, but what stopped Hathcock cold was the sound drifting from this one, not the controlled movements of soldiers, but something that cut through his combat-hardened instincts like a blade. Children's voices, weak, barely audible, speaking in rapid Vietnamese, punctuated by sounds that Hathcock recognized from his own childhood, the desperate crying of severe hunger. Through his scope, he could make out 3 small figures huddled beneath the makeshift roof of palm fronds and torn canvas. None appeared older than 8 or 9. Their clothes hung in tatters, and even from his concealed position, Hathcock could see the telltale signs of severe malnutrition. These weren't child soldiers or enemy scouts. These were civilians, displaced by the fighting, who had somehow ended up alone in one of the most contested pieces of real estate in South Vietnam. For 17 minutes, Hathcock remained motionless, his training warring with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel. His mission parameters were clear. Locate and eliminate enemy snipers, gather intelligence on troop movements, avoid civilian contact that might compromise operational security. These children represented a potentially catastrophic complication, but the sound of retching from the shelter made the decision for him. Hathcock carried 5 days' worth of sea rations in his pack: ham and eggs, beef slices in juice, crackers and cheese spread that tasted like salted cardboard. To a professional soldier operating in enemy territory, these rations represented survival itself. To children who hadn't eaten in days, they might as well have been a feast prepared by angels. If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. What happens when a soldier trained to kill must choose between mission and mercy? At 7:47 a.m., Hathcock made his choice. Moving with the same deliberate precision he used when approaching a target, he began working his way toward the shelter. Every sense strained for signs of ambush. His rifle remained ready, safety off, finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. The jungle around him could hide a dozen enemy soldiers, and his movement toward the children would make him visible to anyone watching the area. The children spotted him when he was still 30 yards away. Their reaction told Hathcock everything he needed to know about their circumstances. Instead of calling out or trying to flee, they simply stared with the blank, hopeless expression of people who had moved beyond fear into numb acceptance. The oldest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 9, positioned herself protectively in front of the 2 smaller children, her thin arms spread wide in a gesture both heartbreaking and defiant. Hathcock approached slowly, rifle slung but accessible, one hand raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent. When he reached the edge of the shelter, he could see that his first assessment had been optimistic. These children weren't just hungry, they were dying. Their eyes had the hollow, unfocused quality that combat medics recognized as the final stages of starvation. Without speaking, he knew perhaps 20 words of Vietnamese, none appropriate for this situation. Hathcock lowered his pack and began extracting his rations. The children watched with a mixture of fear and desperate hope as he opened the first can of ham and eggs. The smell of the food caused an immediate reaction. The 2 conscious children began crying, not from sadness, but from a kind of physiological relief that their bodies recognized before their minds could process what was happening. 2 miles away, in a North Vietnamese observation post hidden in the canopy, Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Duc lowered his binoculars and stared at his radio man in disbelief. "You saw this correctly? The American sniper with the white feather?" "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant, he is feeding our children." "The children from the village that was shelled last week?" "It appears so, sir. Duke had been tracking this particular American for months. The bounty on the white feather's head would feed his unit for a year, and Duke's own younger brother had fallen to an American sniper's bullet near Khe Sanh just 3 months prior. Every instinct told him to signal his marksman to take the shot. The American was exposed, vulnerable, focused on something other than warfare. But as Duke watched through his field glasses, something stayed his hand. The American soldier was carefully measuring water from his canteen, helping the weakest child swallow small amounts of liquid. This was not the behavior of the brutal invaders described in their political briefings. "Maintain observation," Duke whispered to his radio operator. "Do not engage." Back at the shelter, Hathcock had opened every can in his pack. The girl he had begun to think of as the leader reached for food with hands that shook so severely she could barely grasp it. Hathcock guided her movements, helping her bring small spoonfuls to her mouth, then to the mouth of the younger boy beside her. The unconscious child required more delicate handling. Hathcock dripped small amounts of juice from the canned beef between his lips, watching for swallowing reflexes. For the next hour and 27 minutes, Hathcock fed 3 Vietnamese children with food intended to sustain an American sniper in enemy territory. He watched them eat with the controlled desperation of people who understood that this meal might be their last chance at survival. While they ate, he maintained his vigil, scanning the jungle for signs of the enemy sniper who had brought him to this place. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to save 3 lives, he had made himself vulnerable to the man whose job it was to kill American soldiers. Can a moment of mercy exist in the middle of a war designed to eliminate it? The girl spoke to him once, a rapid stream of Vietnamese that he couldn't understand, but whose meaning seemed clear. Gratitude mixed with confusion, the bewilderment of a child trying to comprehend why an enemy soldier was keeping her alive. Hathcock responded in English, his voice kept low to avoid carrying through the jungle. "I'm sorry, little one. Sorry this war found you. Hope you find your families when this is all over." The language barrier was complete, but something in his tone seemed to reach her. She nodded and returned to feeding the younger children, distributing the food with a fairness that spoke of someone who had learned too young how to ration hope. 3 days later, at Firebase Charlie, 30 kilometers southeast of the DMZ, Corporal Jimmy Martinez was distributing mail when he noticed Hathcock sitting alone at the edge of the perimeter, staring into the jungle. Martinez had served with the legendary sniper for 8 months and had never seen him like this, distant, preoccupied, almost haunted. "Letter from home, Gunny," Martinez said, holding out an envelope postmarked Little Rock, Arkansas. Hathcock took the letter but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he continued staring at the tree line where morning mist clung to the mahogany and teak trees like memories that wouldn't fade. The letter was from his mother, written in her careful script on blue stationery that smelled faintly of her rose garden. She wrote about the neighbors asking after him, about his father's struggle with the farm, about the protest marches she'd seen on television. But it was the final paragraph that cut deepest. "I know you're doing what you think is right, Carlos. I know the Marines taught you that the Vietnamese are all enemies. But I keep thinking about Mrs. Chen at the grocery store and how she worries about her nephew somewhere over there. War makes people forget that the other side has mothers and children too." Hathcock folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket next to his New Testament and the photograph of himself in dress blues that he'd planned to send home. His mother had always possessed an uncomfortable ability to see through to the heart of things. 2 weeks passed before his next mission. Intelligence had identified increased NVA activity in the same sector where he'd encountered the children. As Hathcock prepared his gear, checking and rechecking his rifle, Staff Sergeant Williams approached with the briefing. "Word is they've got a sniper school operating somewhere in that area, probably training the bastards who've been picking off our boys near the DMZ." Hathcock nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He found himself wondering about 3 children whose names he'd never learned, whether they'd found their way to safety, whether they remembered the American soldier who'd shared his rations in a jungle clearing. "You all right, Gunny? You've been different since that last mission." "Just thinking about the job, Staff Sergeant." But that wasn't entirely true. For the first time in 2 tours, Hathcock was thinking about more than just the job. He was thinking about the faces in his scope, about the villages that had been shelled, about the difference between an enemy soldier and a starving child. The certainty that had carried him through 73 confirmed kills was beginning to crack around the edges. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. How long can a soldier carry 2 conflicting truths before something breaks? The mission that would define the rest of Hathcock's war began on March 3, 1968, when his spotter, Lance Corporal Burke, woke him before dawn with urgent intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance had identified what appeared to be a training facility deep in the jungle, the same area where NVA snipers had been operating with increasing effectiveness. "They want us to observe and report, Gunny. Rules of engagement are clear. No shots unless we're compromised." But as they moved through the pre-dawn darkness, Hathcock carried more than his rifle and standard gear. Hidden in the bottom of his pack were 4 additional cans of sea rations, a first aid kit he'd borrowed from the aid station, and a canteen filled with water purification tablets. He told himself it was standard preparation. He didn't examine why he'd chosen supplies that would be useful for treating sick children. 8 kilometers from their objective, they discovered they weren't alone in the jungle. A North Vietnamese patrol was moving parallel to their route. But something was wrong. Through his binoculars, Hathcock could see soldiers carrying stretchers, moving with the careful urgency of a medical evacuation rather than a combat patrol. One of the stretchers carried a small form wrapped in a poncho liner. Berg whispered into his radio, reporting the contact, but Hathcock was studying the faces of the enemy soldiers. They moved with the same quiet desperation he'd seen in American medics carrying wounded Marines to dust-off zones. War, he realized, looked exactly the same from both sides when someone was dying. The NVA patrol disappeared into a fold in the terrain, but not before Hathcock had seen something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The soldier carrying the head of the stretcher had stopped to adjust his grip, and in that moment, Hathcock had seen his face clearly through the scope. The man was crying. At 1400 hours, they reached their observation point overlooking the suspected training facility. What they found was both more and less than intelligence had suggested. Yes, there were soldiers being trained in marksmanship techniques. But the facility also served as a field hospital, a refugee processing center, and what appeared to be a school for local children. Through his scope, Hathcock watched North Vietnamese medics treating wounded soldiers and civilians with the same careful attention he'd seen from American doctors. He saw instructors teaching young soldiers to read, not just to kill. He saw a grandmother teaching a group of children to weave baskets while their parents worked in the camp's small agricultural plot. Most disturbing of all, he saw the 3 children he'd fed 2 weeks earlier. They were alive, healthy, integrated into the life of the camp. The girl who had served as their leader was now helping younger children with their lessons. The boys were working alongside adults, contributing to the community that had taken them in. They had been saved, fed, cared for by the enemy. Burke was focused on counting soldiers and weapons, dutifully recording intelligence for their report. But Hathcock was watching something that didn't fit into any tactical assessment he'd ever been taught to make. He was watching humanity persist in the middle of war, watching people he'd been trained to see as faceless enemies living lives that looked remarkably like the ones he'd left behind in Arkansas. That night, as they maintained their watch, Hathcock began to understand something that would change everything he thought he knew about his role in this war. The enemy had children, grandmothers, medics who wept over their patients, teachers who cared about literacy as much as marksmanship. The enemy looked almost exactly like people. When did you first realize that the other side of any conflict has families, dreams, and sorrows just like your own? On the 3rd day of observation, Hathcock discovered the secret that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. Hidden among his personal effects, tucked between pages of his field manual, was a letter that had been intercepted from a North Vietnamese soldier, a standard intelligence practice he'd never paid much attention to before. The letter was written in Vietnamese, but a translator at Firebase Charlie had provided an English summary clipped to the original. It was from Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Duc to his wife in Hanoi, dated just 5 days earlier. "My beloved Lin," the translation read, "today I watched something that has shaken my faith in everything we have been told about the American soldiers. One of their snipers, the one with the white feather that we have been ordered to hunt, spent more than an hour feeding starving children, his own rations given freely to Vietnamese children while he remained exposed to our fire. I had a clear shot. I chose not to take it. How can we call such a man our enemy? How can we teach our own children that all Americans are monsters when I have seen one risk his life to save ours?" Hathcock read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking slightly. Duke had been watching him. The NVA sniper he'd been hunting for weeks had held his life in his hands and chosen mercy over mission, just as Hathcock himself had done. Burke noticed his change in demeanor. "Something wrong, Gunny?" "No, just intel stuff." But everything was wrong. The war that had seemed clear and necessary when he'd enlisted in 1959 had become something else entirely. If Duke could choose compassion over orders, if North Vietnamese medics could weep over dying patients, if enemy camps could harbor teachers and grandmothers and children learning to read, then what exactly was Hathcock fighting for? That afternoon, their observation took on a different character entirely. Using his scope, Hathcock began studying individual faces instead of tactical positions. He watched a North Vietnamese instructor teaching a young soldier to clean his rifle, the same careful attention to detail that Hathcock remembered from his own training at Paris Island. He saw a cook distributing rice to children with the same portion-measuring care that characterized American mess halls. He watched sentries maintaining their posts with the professional boredom of soldiers everywhere. Most significantly, he watched the 3 children he'd fed. The girl was now wearing a clean dress and had gained weight. The boys were laughing during a break in their lessons. They had been given the gift of childhood again, restored to something approaching normalcy in a world that had tried to destroy them. At 1800 hours, Burke began preparing their final intelligence report. Standard procedure required a detailed tactical assessment: troop numbers, weapons counts, defensive positions, potential targets for airstrikes or artillery. Burke had done his job thoroughly. His report would result in the destruction of the facility within 72 hours. Hathcock stared at his own notes, at the clinical language that would transform living, breathing human beings into grid coordinates and casualty estimates. His report would kill the medics who had treated wounded civilians. It would kill the teachers who had given literacy to child soldiers. It would kill the grandmother who taught basket weaving. It would kill 3 children who had already survived more than any child should have to endure. For the first time in his military career, Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, holder of 73 confirmed kills, recipient of the Silver Star, the pride of Marine Corps sniper training, began to understand the full weight of what he had been asked to do. The sea ration cans were still there in the bottom of his pack, a reminder of the choice he had made 2 weeks earlier. But now they represented something larger than a single act of mercy. They represented the possibility that in every war on both sides, there were moments when soldiers had to choose between following orders and following their conscience. Hathcock looked at Burke's completed report, then at the camp below where children were being called in for their evening meal. He thought about Duke's letter, about a sniper who had chosen not to kill when he had the chance. He thought about his mother's words, about enemies having mothers and children too. And then he made the second most important decision of his military career. What would you choose, loyalty to orders or loyalty to the truth your own eyes had shown you? Hathcock's after-action report, filed on March 6, 1968, contained every tactical detail that Burke had recorded, except one. He omitted the location of the medical facility, the school, and the refugee processing center. His report described a defunct training camp with minimal strategic value, recommending against airstrikes due to the dispersed nature of the target and high probability of civilian casualties in surrounding villages. Burke never knew about the omission. The coordinates in their shared report placed the target 3 kilometers east of the actual location, in an abandoned valley that contained nothing but empty jungle and the rusted remains of a French colonial outpost. The bombing mission proceeded as scheduled. American F-4 Phantoms dropped 2,000 pounds of ordnance on a target that had been empty for 15 years. 18 hours later, Hathcock's extraction helicopter lifted him out of the jungle that had been his hunting ground for nearly 2 years. As Vietnam fell away beneath him, he carried 2 secrets that would define the rest of his life: the knowledge that he had saved 3 children, and the knowledge that in doing so, he had probably saved dozens of other innocent people as well. The North Vietnamese camp relocated deeper into the jungle, warned by intelligence networks that their position had been compromised. Duke's sniper team was reassigned to a different sector. The 3 children disappeared into the larger machinery of war, their names never recorded in any official document, their faces living only in the memory of an American sniper who had chosen to feed rather than fight. Hathcock returned to the United States in April 1968, a decorated veteran with a reputation that would make him a legend in Marine Corps sniper training programs. He married his childhood sweetheart, settled in Virginia, and began a career training the next generation of military marksmen. To the outside world, he had completed his service with honor and distinction. But privately, Carlos Hathcock began a different kind of career. He became one of the first Vietnam veterans to speak honestly about the moral complexities of modern warfare. In interviews with military historians decades later, He would describe that morning of February 17th as one of the most important of his military career, not because of any enemy he had killed, but because of 3 lives he had chosen to preserve. The story became part of the unofficial legend that surrounded Hathcock's service, passed down through generations of Marine snipers as an example of something beyond military effectiveness. It represented a moment when the individual conscience of a soldier transcended the mechanical requirements of warfare, when the humanity that war seeks to suppress reasserted itself in the simple act of sharing food with hungry children. For the Marines who heard the story, it served as a reminder that even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, the choice to preserve life rather than take it remained available to those with the courage to act. Years later, when military historians examined the broader implications of individual actions during the Vietnam War, Hathcock's encounter with the 3 children would be cited as an example of how American forces navigated the moral complexities of a conflict where the distinction between combatant and civilian was often deliberately blurred. The empty sea ration cans that Hathcock left in that jungle clearing rust and decay, becoming part of the ecological cycle that eventually reclaims most physical evidence of human presence in the dense Vietnamese forests. But the memory of that morning, of a sniper choosing to feed rather than fight, of children receiving mercy from an unexpected source, of humanity persisting in the midst of mechanized violence, became part of a different kind of history. It became part of a history measured not in confirmed kills or strategic objectives achieved, but in the small acts of compassion that remind us what we're fighting to preserve. In his final years, when reporters asked Carlos Hathcock about his most important shot as a Marine sniper, he would smile and tell them about the morning he chose not to pull the trigger at all. Instead, he opened a can of ham and eggs. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. Which memory do you think lasted longer? The taste of that food or the sound of children laughing? Note, this story is adapted from historical accounts and represents the kinds of moral complexities faced by soldiers in the Vietnam War. While Carlos Hathcock was a real person and legendary Marine sniper, the specific events described here are fictional, created to explore themes of humanity, mercy, and moral courage in wartime.